Hello, U.S. History students, and welcome to Unit 6, Lesson 3, The American Homefront During World War II. World War II has a huge impact on the United States. We've gone through the war to end all wars, being World War I. After that, we see a huge decade of prosperity and innovation, and then we go into an economic depression with high unemployment, loss of property. And throughout the Depression, we see the rise of these dictators in Europe promoting totalitarian government, which goes against what Americans believe. It's not until 1939, when Hitler invades Poland, that the Second World War begins, and we see our allies begin to fight those same dictators that we had seen taking control in Europe. But we stay neutral. We don't want to get involved. We will offer our friends supplies as long as they pay for them and transport them. And later, when they can no longer do that, we lend them the goods. But it's not until 1941, when the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, that the United States gets involved. And the war effort has a huge impact on bringing the United States into more of a position of world power, but also as a means of getting the U.S. out of the Great Depression. And that's what we're going to look at in this lesson. To win the wars in Europe and the Pacific, as well as to meet demands that we still have to have at home, the U.S. government grows to the largest size ever in American history by creating different agencies, putting acts in place to help protect the U.S. The government increases its size even more so than it did during the Depression and the New Deal era. One of these agencies that it creates is the War Production Board, which directs factories to produce war supplies instead of civilian goods. And the thought process behind this is that if we can make more guns and more planes and more ships and more bombs than the bad guys, then we're going to win the war. A new innovation during this time period that really helps this production is prefabrication. Basically, building all of the pieces that it takes to create the item, whether it's an airplane, a ship, whatever it is, making all the pieces beforehand. That way, they can put them together like a puzzle, and it takes a lot less time to create the goods that are needed. This allows for shipbuilders, for example, to make a battleship in 2 weeks as opposed to 1 year. Because prior to that, it took about 355 days to build a battleship. Now that production is lessened to 14 days. This makes it to where we can build the number of ships, the number of planes, the number of tanks that we need to outproduce the bad guys. One of the acts that's put in place to protect America is the War Powers Act. And while we would see this as a bad thing in 2019, many Americans saw it as their duty as American citizens to help the war effort to not talk about the war. It expands the power of the government to use censorship. So basically what this does is, if a soldier is sending a letter home, for example, the government would read it to make sure that it had no sensitive information that could be intercepted by the bad guys and used against us. And this also included regular speech, regular conversations. It was to prevent people from saying something that the enemy might hear, because you never know if there's a spy in your midst, to use against us in the war. So it just got people to stop talking about things that they probably shouldn't be talking about in public. And it did limit your freedom of speech. You could get in trouble for saying things about the war that could get you in trouble, like could get the United States in trouble. But many people didn't see this as a bad thing. They saw it as their duty to help the war effort. As we start the war, many government soldiers need to be drafted. We got to build up our army. We have to have a larger army for the same reason as ramping up production. We really need to outproduce, out-soldier everything. We need to be better than the bad guys. And we'll talk more about the draft momentarily. But one of the ways that the government funds the war, just like in World War I, is by selling war bonds. And a bond would be sold to the citizen for $18.75 with the promise that the government would pay you back with interest in 10 years. So, for example, if you pay your $18.75 in 1943 and you buy a war bond, in 1953, the government would pay you back $25. And millions of Americans are buying these bonds. The ways that we try to encourage people to do this are through war bond tours, where celebrities, musicians, and eventually war heroes, the 3 surviving flag raisers from the Battle of Iwo Jima, will eventually go on the 7th war bond tour, which would be the last war bond tour. So we go through 7 tours around the nation where these people are trying to get people to buy the war bonds. And over the course of those 7 tours, we raise $187 billion for the war effort. If you divide that by the price of that bond, we sold almost 10 billion war bonds over the course of World War II. And this helps to fund the war and make sure that we can win. And another way that you would be prompted to purchase these bonds is through patriotism and remembrance. And we would see these things in newsreels, which were the way that people would get their news prior to going to see a movie. Not only would you get news, but you would also get propaganda to try to get you to buy the war bonds. And so right now we're going to look at an example of one of those newsreels.
Haven't forgotten this, have you? Yes, they bit off a mouthful when they sneaked in on us at Pearl Harbor. They're beginning to find that out now. We've built thousands of ships since December 7th, 1941. And so many thousands of planes, they'll never know what hit them when we turn on the heat. But it takes a lot of dough to turn out these weapons of attack. What are you doing about that? Is your money helping to build and fight these planes? Is your money helping to land the Marines? Is your money firing these guns? Dig down, brother. See your war bond officer. Buy another bond on Pearl Harbor Day. Make December 7th a day the Japs will never forget.
The Office of War Information directs things like this, and they direct all propaganda having to do with the war. And again, propaganda is information used to promote or publicize a political cause or point of view. In this case, that political cause is the war. And they would use these methods, such as the newsreels or the posters, to encourage people to do what they need for the war effort. So United We Win, for example, is if we come together and we work together regardless of race, we will get through this war. Remembrance of certain events is also a way they would get you to do your wartime duty. So, for example, remember Pearl Harbor. And then it got comical in many of these, like the Hitler poster here. Let's catch him with his panzers down. A panzer is a German tank, which is why there's tanks in the picture. But in this sense, it's let's catch him with his pants down. And then things like Captain America of Marvel fame were created in this time period, very similar to what you see in Captain America, the First Avenger, to promote patriotism and have this superhero that's going to be fighting Hitler for us. The wartime production also leads to a huge shortage of consumer goods and high demand essential material that's used for the war effort. Because of these shortages, the government creates the Office of the Price Administration, and the purpose of this was to establish a system of rationing that would more fairly distribute the goods that were in short supply. So every American is issued a series of ration books throughout the war. And these ration books would have stamps that were good for certain items like sugar, meat, cooking oil, canned goods, gasoline, and each stamp would be assigned a point value. A person could not purchase any of these goods at the grocery store or at the gas station without having the right amount of points. Once you used up your points for the month, you were out of luck. You couldn't buy any more of that item. And this was a way that the American people really could help on the home front. Make sure that we have enough goods for us as well as for the war effort. This also leads a lot of Americans to ration, recycle, and make sure that we've got enough of what's needed. Recycling becomes extremely popular during World War II because we need metal, we need oil, we need tires, rubber, we need nylon for parachutes. And so a lot of Americans recycle whatever they can. This also brings us to building victory gardens again, just like we did in World War I, where Americans would build little gardens in their backyard, plant vegetables, because fresh vegetables are very hard to come by during the war because we're feeding our soldiers as well. So Americans are building these gardens to where they can have fresh vegetables for their family that are not rationed because they don't have to purchase them. And this makes their ration points go a lot farther because they don't have to use any ration stamps to get these vegetables, so it's more food for their family without having to use up as many stamps. Because once those stamps are gone, they're gone until you get a new book. You can't use anybody else's. It's against the law. War production also creates new jobs because we've got to build all this new stuff. New jobs stimulate the economy, more money in the pockets of these people where they could then invest in other industries. And this leads to the end of the Great Depression after 15 years of depression on the American side. When the U.S. declares war, we also need soldiers. We got to have men to fight. And at this point, women are not allowed to fight in combat positions. So we're fighting a two-front war. We got to have people to help us. After Pearl Harbor, we do see the enlistment of 6 million men who volunteer, either out of patriotism or out of a want to get back at the Japanese for what they did. But 6 million is not enough. Over the course of the war, 10 million more were drafted into service. So if your number was called, and that means like when they call the number that's on your draft card, you have to go and fight. You cannot avoid it. And because we've got this huge amount of people that we've now got to train, we need more camps to train them. And most of these pop up in the South. The reason being is because in the South, there's more steady weather year-round. So as we need soldiers, we can send them to go train, and weather will not be an issue. During World War II, everything soldiers are given is government issue. The government is issuing all of these things. And so just like in World War I, when we see American soldiers being called doughboys, during World War II, American soldiers are known as GIs for government issue. But most of these people they're supposed to be 18. But many men lie about their age to enlist. For example, there's a story of two guys at the Battle of Iwo Jima in 1945 who faked their ages to enlist early because they wanted to fight, and they were only 16 years old. These are people who've never been away from their families, never been away from home, and homesickness becomes a really big problem. They want to go home, they want to see their families. They can't just pick up the phone and call them either because communication's not the same as it is today back then. So the government creates the USO, which is an organization that goes over to where these soldiers are around the world in these battle zones and help make them feel better, help bring up morale. And most of the time the government would enlist actors, comedians, singers, and things like that to help entertain the troops so that they won't feel as homesick, they won't feel as down, and morale will improve. If we've got happy soldiers, then we're more likely to win the fight. So people like Bob Hope, who's a huge celebrity during the time period, as well as Judy Garland, who was a singer of the era. She was the star of The Wizard of Oz, which was one of the more popular films of the 1930s. And they would just go around to all of these different bases around the world and put on shows for the soldiers to help them feel better. During World War II, the United States is very much still in the midst of Jim Crow. We're still very segregated, and this translates to the military as well. More than 1 million African American soldiers serve in these segregated units under the command of white officers. And this doesn't end until after the war's over. But it's because of the heroics of these African Americans during the war that President Truman does officially issue a presidential order in 1947 to desegregate the military. Black soldiers were allowed to fight, and some of the most prolific African American soldiers or pilots were the Tuskegee Airmen. And this was an African American regiment of pilots in what was then the Army Air Corps, who fought several combat missions and were recognized for their heroism. But that doesn't take away from the discrimination that was happening. There's one story that's told by one of the Tuskegee Airmen that there had been a plane that was severely damaged and at risk of crashing behind enemy lines. So they go up to go get this plane to bring it home safely. And they both land safely. Everything's okay. The white pilot gets out of his plane to go thank this person who's just saved his life, sees that it's an African American pilot, turns around and walks away. So this guy's just saved his life, but because of the color of his skin, he does not say thank you to him. But it's because of the heroism and because the fact that they fought so valiantly that Truman does desegregate the military in 1947, among many other aspects of African Americans' war efforts throughout the entirety of the 4-year conflict. World War II creates thousands of war-related factory jobs, and those factory jobs need people to work in them. Otherwise, we're not going to produce the goods we need. And this is the way that African Americans help on the home front. The Great Migration continues as African Americans are leaving the Jim Crow South, that area where they're hugely discriminated against, hugely segregated, and they're going to northern cities to get the jobs that in these war factories that are going to help not only get us out of the Great Depression, but this combined with the heroism of the soldiers will help lead to Truman's decision to desegregate. And this is just one step on the path to civil rights that we're going to see in the 1940s and 50s. This is led by a gentleman named A. Philip Randolph. And he sees what's happening in discrimination. He sees that our soldiers, African American soldiers, are fighting in segregated units. He sees that they're segregated in the war jobs. And he doesn't see this as fair. At this point, we're all Americans. We're all fighting for the same thing. So why not fight together? And he threatens FDR that if FDR doesn't help the African Americans, then Randolph is going to lead a march on Washington. And he's going to promote this by posters such as the one here in the bottom left of your screen that says, "Why should we march? 15,000 Negroes assembled in St. Louis, Missouri. 20,000 Negroes assembled in Chicago, Illinois. 23,500 Negroes assembled in New York City. Millions of Negro Americans all over this great land claim the right to be free. Free from want, free from fear, free from Jim Crow." And this threat leads to FDR to offer equal pay for African American workers because they were being paid less, as well as creating the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which is a step in de-escalating the discrimination in the workplace. And this all happens during World War II. World War II not only leads to more opportunities for African Americans, but also women. Women are not allowed to fight in combat positions. So as the men are going overseas, the women are staying behind and have to be the ones in these military plants and working in building bombs and building planes. 6 million women enter the workforce in both clerical positions such as secretaries and phone operators, as well as in war-related industries. And we get propaganda encouraging women to do this in examples of like Rosie the Riveter, this very historic and very popular "We Can Do It" Rosie the Riveter poster, who's encouraging women to join the workforce and saying, like, we can do it. We can help win this war. Not only joining the workforce as civilians, but also joining the workforce as military personnel. We see 200,000 women joining non-combat military units. We see them joining the Navy as the Waves. We see them joining the Army as the WACs, or the Women's Army Corps. And we also see many women joining what was then the Army Air Corps, but they become pilots. And they help train many of the male pilots. And even though they're not fighting in the combat positions, they're not the ones shooting the guns at the Nazis and the Japanese, they still have a huge impact on the war, both on the home front and in the military. They serve as military nurses in many cases, as well as photographers to document the happenings that are going on, to ensure that future generations know firsthand accounts of these events. Unfortunately, fear spreads throughout the country, and many Americans start to see Japanese people and many other Asian peoples as racially inferior. And they use those racial stereotypes to really encourage people to fight against the Japanese. These are just 2 examples of those stereotypes that are perpetuated throughout the war. The top one says, "Open trap, make happy Jap." The bottom one, much waste of material makes so happy. These are extremely racially discriminative, and it's all really done out of fear. And Americans are using these to describe the enemy, but throughout the United States, we have many Japanese Americans that were born here, and they're being discriminated against because of something that they had nothing to do with. Because of Pearl Harbor, that fear just continues to escalate. Many Americans believe that the Japanese are spying on us, or if they're not spying, they're helping to prepare for a Japanese invasion of the U.S. as like Pearl Harbor Part 2. And all of this leads to, by 1942, Roosevelt issues Executive Order 9066, which relocates 112,000 Japanese Americans to internment camps away from the Pacific coast because they're fearing, okay, if we let them stay on the Pacific coast, maybe they're going to get messages to the Japanese, maybe they're going to get information to them, and they're going to come and attack us. And they put them in these internment camps as a means of keeping a closer eye on them because they're scared. They say it's for national security, but in the 1980s, the government does finally admit it was because we were afraid. And it's not until then, in the 1980s, 40 years later, that the government says, essentially, I'm sorry, and pays reparations to the people that were held in those camps. And please do not confuse an internment camp with the German Nazi concentration camps. We did not kill the Japanese Americans in these internment camps. It was simply a surveillance and keeping an eye on them type of thing. There was no intention of hurting the Japanese as far as physically hurting them. The Nazis meant to kill the Jews. So an internment camp and a concentration camp are two completely separate situations. And in the internment camps that we put the Japanese in, we did not kill them. Here's a few pictures from the era that'll give you a better understanding of exactly what they had to go through. And this is happening to not only Issei, which are Japanese immigrants to the United States, but also Nisei, which are American-born people with Japanese ancestry, who, under the 14th Amendment, should get the rights under the Constitution. But because of the extreme fear, these people are having to leave their businesses, they're having to leave their homes, their pets, and they're only allowed to take with them what they can carry. So you have to choose very wisely on what you're going to take with you. And you'll go to these camps and you'll live in these very quickly, crudely constructed homes. They're not nice. It's not very comfortable. And these people were left to live in these internment camps for the remainder of the war. So if you got transported to one of these camps in 1942, you were there for 3 or 4 years, because the war's not over until 1945, and they didn't let them go immediately after Japan surrendered. It was a process of letting them out. The Japanese internment camps faced bad living conditions and a lack of civil rights. And again, it's not until the 1980s that the government finally admits this was not because of national security situations. It was because we were scared. And in the late 1980s, over 40 years after this occurs, they finally do pay reparations to those who were held in the camps. This brings us to the end of Unit 6, Lesson 3. See you back here for Lesson 4, and I hope that you have a great day.